Hi, Vern. How you doing today?
Hi, Nick. I'm doing well. This is we're going to talk a little bit about borough taxes. That's we're going to start our budget cycle and how the budget works, how we come to a budget, and we're going to try to answer some questions that I think the public will be interested in. And so let's start with total revenue.
Okay.
And total revenue is the total amount of dollars that the borough is going to spend or receive, and that number is right around $409 million. That certainly is not tax money, that's total revenue, so you got the state and federal money included in that. And right. What else would be included in that, Nick?
Well, so when most people say tax money, people tend to think of area-wide real property taxes. Right. And so the borough's budget is composed of a lot of different components. Of course, area-wide real property taxes is a large component of our budget. But we have things like state pass-through grants, right. State grants to the borough. Right. A good example of a pass-through grant would be school funding. When you hear about the base student allocation in Juneau, and then the cost differential, and all that money adds up and comes through the borough to the school district. Well, it's included in the overall borough budget. We get grants. The borough gets grants itself.
So that's all part of the total revenue that the borough is using.
Part of the total revenue. So then we also have, of course, area-wide real property taxes, as I mentioned, but we have other area-wide taxes. And what area-wide means is it's the taxes levied whether you're in a city or not, so it's everywhere. Right. Non-area-wide, by way of comparison, means we're going to tax everything that's outside the cities, because of course the cities are their own government, and they tax for their own things. So we have other non-area-wide taxes, which include the motor vehicle registration tax, the bed tax, which we call the transient accommodations right. tax, bed tax, the tobacco excise tax.
So all of these revenues are part of the borough revenues, because the total revenue is $409 million.
Correct. And
the total borough revenues are, in my understanding, is about $125 million. And then in that total borough revenue, $125 million, you're talking about the excise taxes, the area-wide mill levy, and all of those incomes, or all those that go into that number.
And then we also have service areas. The borough runs right. a large number of road service areas and fire service areas, and then just a couple of what we call special service areas because they're not road or fire. We have a, up in Talkeetna.
There's a flood service area.
Flood service area, plus the water and sewer
right.
is run as a service area. And of course, out here towards the Butte, there's a erosion service area as well.
So when somebody receives their property tax on their card, they're going to see the area-wide mill levy. They could see a road service area mill levy if they have a road service area. They could see a fire service area mill levy, and then they could see the special flood service or included in that, plus the non-area-wide.
Plus non-area-wide. So, and then for people who live in the cities, they could potentially have a city property tax
right,
as well.
In addition,
but they would not have the non-area-wide right, then,
right.
because that's only a. So when you get your tax bill, what you see is you see the various lines across on what they are, and then the bottom number is the total of those mill rates. And the mill rate that's what the assembly levies in terms of. This is the mill rate we're setting. It's a legislative function, and the way you get your tax bill it's the mill rate right. multiplied by the value of your property.
The assessed value.
And that equals the number.
And the assessed value, a lot of people misunderstand that. The assessed value of properties is not set by the assembly. That's a total separate assessment by a different department.
Correct. The assessed value by state law is set by the borough assessor. And in a borough this large, we have an assessor who has a lot of assistants right. who we call appraisers. And they set values. And the assembly has zero part in it. And in fact, even if the assembly tried to get a part in it, my office would say you can't. The manager's office would probably right. say you can't. And I know the assessors would say you can't. Because if you disagree with your assessment, you get to file an appeal to a board here in the borough. Right. And then if you disagree with that, you get to go to court. You get to file an appeal to court. It's not like a direct lawsuit. You file an appeal, and you put all the paperwork in front of a judge who would decide whether or not your assessment was valid right. or not valid.
So when I look at it too, if you have a $100,000 assessed value house or $200,000 assessed value house, if your mill rate's 9 for $100,000, that's $900.
Correct.
For $200,000, that'd be $1,800 taxes due. So that's how we develop it and look at it. So.
Correct. So when you take the mill rate, the total mill rate, if it's 10 and your house is right. $300,000, it'd be a $3,000 tax bill. So
when people hear that we got a $409 million budget, I guess the biggest part of that is not borough revenue. The total borough revenue is $125 million. So there's a huge chunk, 290 million, that's coming from state or federal other revenues, I guess, is the crux of the matter.
Right. So some other areas of revenue that we have, two other kind of smaller areas. We do collect some fees.
This is in borough revenue,
This
correct?
is in borough revenue. So we collect some fees. We collect fees for permits and applications, business licenses fees, things of that nature. And then we also have interest earnings. It's not a ton, but just like anybody else earns money off of interest, we do as well.
That'd be in other revenue. So like last year, we had $82 million in Areawide taxes and $43 million in other revenue. So you're talking about other revenue coming into the borough for our operations.
Correct.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of these things, when we talk about them here, we're talking rather generally. And I'm sure if anybody looks at this and really wants to dig into it, they might go, oh, what you're talking about there isn't quite right. For the average person, this is the general explanation.
Yeah,
if you really wanted to get into the nitty-gritty of all of it, you'd probably need an accounting degree and have to sit down with one of our high-level accountants to really explain how this works. But as a general matter, this is how it all breaks out.
Yeah, the budget to me, I remember my first year on the assembly, it was really shocking to get my hands around it, and it's a fairly good size 3-wing binder with every department, every fund broken down, every road service area broken down, every fire service area broken down, and of course the Fund 100, that's the general operating monies for the borough. And now I feel a lot more comfortable with it myself, but every penny is accounted for. I think
yes,
in the budgets from every department all the way through the road service areas and fire service areas. It's very detailed. We have a chief financial officer with a huge staff, plus we have other people, auditors, checking it every year.
That's right.
So every dollar that's coming in, there's an outgoing dollar, and so it's very rigorous, and I think that's something that makes me feel good to know that every penny's accounted for.
Yeah, every penny's accounted for, and we know that on the back end because we get audited every year. Our auditors at a firm called BDO, and we must have an audit done every year by state law to make sure that it's the public's money we're talking about. Right. It's the public, it's the taxpayers and the fees and the revenues, or the grants or the federal money, the state money. All of that money is all accounted for down to the penny.
Is it safe to say no one likes to pay taxes?
Well, I certainly don't.
I think, yeah, I certainly don't. I think that's a safe statement to make. But it's a necessity in the world we live in now. So good accounting and auditing and making sure we use our tax dollars wisely is good. So why don't we talk about schools a little bit now? We know that schools are our biggest ticket item as part of our budget. Certainly that 400 million, schools take up a good percentage of it. From the borough's tax base, it's right around, I think last year, $52 million in that neighborhood.
Approximately. Yep.
Approximately, and they're asking for a 3% raise this year. And I guess we always get into this debate, what percentage is it of our total budget and things like that. It looks like it's usually right around 6 mils of your total area-wide mill rate, 9.662. But I think the schools have a good argument that if you look at it in total revenues from operations, our borough operating budget's 41%, while the school operating budget's 36%. And so there's a lot of different ways to look at the school monies.
I think there is, because a lot of people tend to think of, well, what's the real property tax dollars going to the schools? And you mentioned the number about 6 mils.
But that's not, we still got to remember, we've got total revenues of the borough.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so as we talked about, if you look at the area-wide revenues in total, they're more than just the area-wide real property taxes. And the borough does not account or manage accounting in such a way that you can track, well, how much of the bed tax or the motor vehicle tax went into the legal department.
Exactly.
What you can say is how much of area-wide revenue went into the legal department. Same thing with the school district.
Exactly.
So if you say, well, what went to the school district in terms of the real property taxes? Well, we don't really track it that way. It's total area-wide revenue, and how does it get spent? And remember, the area-wide revenue is composed of all of these different parts that are then put together to get to this.
Well,
I forgot what the number was.
Sitting on the assembly, I think I can speak for most assembly members and the mayor. that it is our largest big ticket item number, and it's our highest priority, schools, to fund our schools and share the funding with the state. And so I think there's sometimes a little misconception there, but that's our priority. Then of course after that we've got roads and EMS fire, our next 2-3 biggest priorities.
Yeah.
Probably an equal status of all of them.
And remember, schools, we not only have the operating component, we have the debt component.
Right.
Because with a large and growing population, you know, we're the place to live, the place to be, fastest growing borough in the state by far, one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. I think we were 36th or 38th in the nation at the last census. You have to build more schools.
So well, we know we got Joe Reddington Senior High School coming online next summer. That's part of the new schools we built. Iditarod Elementary and Wasilla, we're going to start construction this summer, I believe. All of those schools are being built. And of course, Wasilla High School was overcrowded for many, many years.
Right.
Built for 750 and at 1,200, so we're trying to alleviate that problem.
And so even with the state reimbursement, which is usually 70%, you know, that still leaves some money coming from the borough, either the real property tax or the area-wide revenue, however you want to have the discussion. It leaves a percentage coming from the borough for those capital costs as
paying
well.
the debt service of those bonds and school construction.
Okay, so here's the best example I can give you. And let's, you know, I'm in the legal department, so I'll talk about my department. If this cup represents what I want to spend next year. So I come to the Borough Assembly and I say, look, I'd like to get money, which is going to be water in my
to run your department, to run the legal department.
And so when we talk about area-wide revenue, the area-wide revenue is composed of real property tax dollars, and we add that to, let's say, tobacco tax dollars, and then we add that together with motor vehicle taxes. And now we have a bunch of
your total borough revenue.
And then we take some of that borough revenue and we give it to the legal department to run.
Well, that was too much, a little too much.
No, sorry. We'll put some back. So then the question becomes, well, how much of this came from the tobacco tax revenue?
Well,
we don't know.
It's kind of irrelevant, really, now, isn't it?
Because it's all revenue. It's all poured together as area-wide revenue and then doled out by the assembly. And what most people, the other thing that most people get maybe a little bit of misconception about is that revenue is one half of the budget and expenditures are the other half of the budget. When we pass our budget ordinance, if you look at the ordinance itself, it's about 7 pages long, and then that giant book is really the attachment. The ordinance itself is about 7 pages long, and it does two things. One, it levies for the collection, and then two, it appropriates for the expenditure. So it does both ends of the equation, which is the money coming in and the money going out. So in the past, assemblies have talked about diversification of area-wide revenues, and then in the past, other assemblies have eliminated taxes from certain revenue streams, and that really is a decision that the assembly makes for what they think is in the best public interest, the best way to, balance the need to run your government versus the burden on the taxpayer and how that gets allocated. Those are assembly questions.
So let's talk about property tax exemptions.
Sure.
There's certain exemptions that apply to the Mat-Su Borough residents, and what are some of those?
Well, first and foremost, the easiest property tax exemption that most people are familiar with is probably the senior disabled property tax exemption. So by state law, the first $150,000 of assessed value is exempt from taxation. So when your borough assessor assigns a value to a home for someone who's a senior that is 65 or older, or a disabled veteran, or a widower of somebody who qualified, the first $150,000 of assessed value is tax exempt. So for example, if you had a $200,000 home, when I explained the way the tax bill works, that mill rate would not get multiplied against the full 200, it would only get multiplied against 50.
Correct.
So that's mandatory by state law. We have no option.
And then is there a borough addition to that exemption?
There is a borough addition. So the borough, a couple of years, had an addition of an additional 20 on that. And then just last October, the borough had a ballot measure to increase that to a total of $218,000 exemption.
So disabled senior citizens and disabled veterans will get $218,000 exempted from their assessed value. And so if they had a house that's worth $200,000, there's no taxes owed at all.
No taxes.
If they have a house that's worth $300,000 assessed value, they would owe on $82,000, correct?
Correct.
So.
And that's a strange number, some might think, 218. But where the number came from was, it's the average assessed value of a standalone single-family residence
in the Mat-Su
Borough, according to the assessor's office.
Tell us a little bit about the ag land exemption.
So the ag land exemption is not what we would think of as a true 100% exemption. What the ag land exemption basically says is when your property qualifies as ag land, and I won't get into what the qualifications are, but if you qualify as ag land,
and that's a borough staff decides for residents?
Yes.
Okay.
You come to the assessor and you apply to be qualified as ag land, and there's a set of criteria in state law. What happens then is the assessor does not assess your land for its true value and highest and best use. See, it gets complicated. There's a state law that mandates that our borough assessor go out and look at land and assess it at fair market value 100%.
Right.
And that means a willing buyer and a willing seller in the market who know about the property, what are they willing to buy and sell that property for? When it comes to ag land, that goes away, and you say, what is a willing buyer and a willing seller willing to do it for ag purposes only? And so because the nature of agriculture is you need lots of land, we're blessed in America, food is cheap, and abundant, good for us, sometimes bad for farmers.
Right.
But in agriculture would include things like flowers, it includes things like ranching, raising crops,
livestock,
raising
poultry,
livestock, poultry, dairy,
bees,
all of that.
It goes on and on, yeah.
And so it's a land, heavy land use dependent thing. And so what state law says is, well, no, you're going to assess it for what a willing buyer and seller would do for ag purposes only. And even those values aren't always the same. You could have a piece of property at one part of the borough, ag value at one level, and a piece of property at a different part of the borough, and the ag value might be different. It's one of the ideas that...
So it's another question for the assessor's office to determine.
It is, because it's a valuation question.
Exactly.
And then they get the same tax bill as everybody else. And it is the area-wide, the non-area-wide, the service areas.
On their assessed value.
All added up, multiplied by that assessed value.
Now, if somebody were to sell their ag rights, how does that work?
So if someone converts ag land away from ag land and builds condominiums or subdivides or just flat out converts the use to a road or something that can't be used as ag anymore, they have to go back 7 years, raise the value to the real property to what it would normally be.
So they're paying back taxes.
They're going to pay back taxes for 7 years on the regular assessed value. So what ag parcels actually get every year is they get two values. They get a normal assessed value plus an ag assessed value that they can come haggle about. Because if they do, they're going to go back 7 years and you're not going to be able to haggle about what those valuations were.
Yep. So it's a good thing for farmers, and it's a good thing for the Mat-Su Borough to have that ag exemption, is my opinion. And let's talk about enterprise funds, something that I've been on the Assembly for going on my 6th year, and it's enterprise funds have always kind of befuddled me a little bit. So tell me a little bit about them.
Okay, so again, these are basic concepts. For the real nitty-gritty, you'd really have to get into it with one of our financial wizards. An enterprise fund is basically...
First of all, in the budget, they'll come in as a separate tab, won't they?
Correct.
Name some of the enterprise funds, just for the start with.
Landfill is the biggest enterprise fund.
What else?
Then we run the port as an enterprise fund. We were running the ferry as an enterprise fund. I don't know if we are still. And I think that might be it.
So basically, the port and landfill are our two big ones.
Correct.
And
so let's talk about the landfill, because that's the one that everybody's pretty familiar with. So the enterprise fund concept is there are no general tax dollars supporting the landfill.
So it's fees, it's revenues?
All fees and perhaps grants.
Fees and grants.
And perhaps loans or bonds. If there was ever a bond, you could bond, right? If there's a bond question.
To like add on to the landfill, to build a new cell and things like that.
The Borough Assembly approved a clean water loan application for like 1% interest to get money because the landfill promotes clean water. And then it needs to be lined and appropriately constructed to make sure we preserve the watershed. And so enterprise funds are not supported by general tax dollars. So
is it fair to say user fees? User fees.
Tipping fees.
Tipping fees, user fees.
The guys that own them will tell you. And so one of the reasons the landfill is an enterprise fund.
We don't call them dumps anymore, do we?
No, I guess not. At least the guys over there don't.
Us old farm boys, it's hard
My
to get
kids
around.
call it the dump.
Everybody calls
Yeah,
it the
you call it
dump.
the
You know?
So one of the reasons, in talking with Don Moore, who's the borough manager from 1990 to 1998, I think, he said the reason they came up with the enterprise fund for the landfill is solid waste disposal is a non-area-wide power. So if you stop and think about that for a minute, that means that if the borough runs a landfill, we can't let the cities put their garbage in it because it's non-area-wide.
Right.
We can't provide that service within the cities. Well, that restriction comes on how we spend our tax money.
Right.
If we're not spending any of our tax money, that
worry about
argument starts to go away,
Right.
at least the argument that we're spending illegally,
Right.
right? So operating as an enterprise fund and with the city's
Eliminated
consent,
those problems.
eliminated the problem of how do you distribute the tax money appropriately when we know
Right.
there's city garbage going into our
Is it safe to say there's no property tax money going to the enterprise fund landfill? It's all user fees and all grants and all other money coming from different sources?
That's correct.
That's correct.
So with the landfill, it is run by user fees. And now, if the user fees are not enough to cover year to year, then the auditors will say, look, you cannot run that as a deficit. You've got to get it in the black.
For budget purposes and for what we're doing, the borough staff running the landfill, which is Public Works, correct?
Correct.
Will present us with the mill rate or the user fee that's
that's
going to fit to the enterprise fund to balance the budget.
That's correct.
So you could see an increase or decrease, more than likely see an increase if it's running in the red.
Correct. It's my understanding that the landfill tipping fees didn't increase for about 10 years.
Right.
And that was...
Well, I think we had a 5-year rate increase when I remember the first year I was on assembly. We had a 5-year rate increase to take them from... What's that?
It didn't happen.
It didn't happen.
No.
That's nice to hear.
It slowed down. So it's supposed to go from 5 to 8, and then after another year go from 8 to 11, and then 11 to 15. And it went from 5 to 8 and sat there for about 3 or 4 years, and just last year it went to 11. And I'm talking about $11 is the typical residential dump. You show up and, hey, this is my stuff, and they do it. There's a weight limit to it. I don't know if it's 250 or 500 pounds.
So
I don't know if it was supposed to go to 15, but it was supposed to go up over a period of years, and that got slowed down. But eventually, if that picks up, and we own all the land out there, and there's a landfill improvement plan, yeah, it could go down.
we know the total revenues.
Right.
Include your Areawide taxes, and they include these other revenues we've been talking about, excise taxes and things like that, to produce $125 million. Now, where does that $125 million get spent?
Well, it gets spent in the budget, and then
And
again,
for
if you look at Fund 100 expenditure, so
Okay.
when you look at it, you're going to see up at the top of all these things, you're going to see on some of them they're going to say revenue, and on the other they're going to say expenditure.
Right.
So you look at expenditure, that means money going out, and of course you start with 101 assembly, 102 assembly reserve, 103 clerk, elections.
So it's
records
just a
management.
very detailed list of exactly where all the money is going out based on the revenue.
And as you go through the budget, it'll break down farther and farther. So
Right.
the budget's almost like an onion. You look at the first couple of pages, you get the budget ordinance, and you've got these very large numbers.
So every year, every department in the Mat-Su Borough presents a budget to the manager, John Musi.
Correct.
When does that occur from a staff standpoint?
It starts in January, and we start rolling up the numbers in January in terms of projecting the budget and looking at what you're doing. And then through February and March, the manager will meet and talk with people. And at the same time, the assessors have got, the tax bills have gone out. The assessment notices will go out in February-ish. And so the assessors will then start to find out if people are appealing their assessed values. Because knowing that the value of the taxable property is very important for the assembly. Because when you levy a mill rate, you want to know how much money you're getting. Because in my 10 years of being here, the assembly has never been in the business of, well, we're going to tax a bunch, but then we're not going to spend it. We're going to kind of keep it. The assembly has always, in my experience here, the assembly has always been, we want to tax just what we need to fund whatever
Our
it is
expenses.
we're looking to fund. We're not
So
looking to overtax.
these departments put together all their budgets. They give them to the manager. The manager puts them together in in a proposed budget for, we're going to have the budget for 2016. I believe it's published today or yesterday, correct?
I believe it's
imminent. It'll be and that'll be presented to the Assembly, and then the Assembly does public hearings and can take testimony and amend sections.
Correct. So the budget, like anything else, is an ordinance.
Right.
And so the budget ordinance, again, is 7 pages, but the attachments, huge. And so the Assembly will start by having a presentation by the manager, and then depending on the year and depending on what's going on, there'll be departmental presentations.
Right.
First, a little maybe like a work session almost.
For each department.
Maybe explain a little bit about what's going on, things like that. Some smaller departments, such as myself and the clerk, don't typically have a large presentation.
So you'll try to be putting more water in your
That's
revenue
right.
cup, right? Every department's putting water in their revenue cup, and of course the expenses are going to go out. There you go.
I just took it all.
So,
and then after that, then there'll be public hearings, usually 2, sometimes more. This year's public hearings, one is in Wasilla, and one I believe is in Willow.
May 7th is going to be one
Right.
in Willow, so the people can come out and testify about specific budget items or the general budget, and talk about the mill rate, service areas, whatever is on their mind.
Yep.
And then at some point in time, the Assembly has to approve the budget, correct?
Correct. So then after the budget public hearings, which satisfy, it's an ordinance, so you have to have a public hearing, just like every other ordinance. That's what these are, they're just bigger. And then afterwards, the public hearing will close, the mayor will gavel out the public hearing, and then the Assembly will be able to debate, and the Assembly can move.
That's when amendments could come in by each Assembly member.
Correct. Amendments up or amendments down.
They're voted on, each amendment's voted on.
Correct. And through the process, you'll get a couple of technical amendments from finance, and there'll be things like, well, you amended over here, so we need to reconcile. We have a borough reserve fund, which says that for every dollar we spend, we hold in a reserve fund 22.5 cents, I think the number is.
22.5% total.
Correct. And that helps our bond rating. It helps us get better interest rates. It helps our bonds sell. And it provides a cushion in the event of a disaster.
I think that reserve fund is probably going to be in the $25 to $26 million area this year.
Based on
22.5% of the total.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
And then we have other reserves too, though. Don't we have an emergency reserve, 1.5 million, I believe? And
then capital reserve.
Yeah, a couple smaller reserves.
Yeah, so we have a couple of smaller reserves that are for specific purposes. Yeah. For example, we also have a school site selection reserve.
Exactly.
A little more specific purposes.
Now another question too: the mayor's role in the budget. Can the mayor veto line item veto during the budget process, or does he wait till after the budget's totally voted on and sent to it?
The mayor has typically waited. All the mayors I've been through have typically waited until the end.
Wait until it's the total budget's passed by the Assembly, and then the mayor has the legal right to go through and line item veto any item they want to veto.
Correct.
And then what's the option for the Assembly then?
So the option for the Assembly is, if there are 5 votes, the Assembly can override the mayor's veto and restore the money back. And the mayor has the option to veto entire line items, or he can simply reduce the numbers. So that is, he can take a number,
that's a veto no matter what.
Down to 0, or he can say, no, you don't need 100, you only need 80, and kind of reduce it a little bit.
But the Assembly could move to override that reduction.
Correct, but it takes 5 of the 7.
Has there ever been a circumstance for the mayor's veto the entire budget? Did you recall?
In the Mat-Su Borough, no.
I believe that'd be highly unlikely, wouldn't it?
I think it would be highly unlikely.
Especially when you have the line item veto. Right. So.
Yeah, and the same rule would apply if if the mayor vetoed an entire budget. If 5 votes pass, then you override the veto, and the budget.
So if there wasn't an override, what circumstance would
the Assembly would have to reconvene with a new ordinance, a new budget ordinance. It might look exactly the same as the old one, but they would have to reconvene with a new ordinance and take it up all over again, and they would have to do it very.
Right, I was going to say there's a legal time we have to have the budget. What is the legal time we have to have the budget approved?
Our code requires that the budget gets approved by the end of May.
By the end of May, so.
May 31st.
And so we've got to have all our public hearings, all our amendments, all the process through and approve the budget by
the end of May. Yeah. The reason is state law requires your tax bill gets mailed by July 1. And so the budget needs to be passed by the end of May because it takes the finance folks some time to make sure that all the numbers are reconciled. Because when you make an amendment, let's say you make an amendment to, a couple of years ago there was an increase in the number of firefighters. Right. That propagates other numbers, such as workers' comp insurance,
Correct.
For the PERS contributions, healthcare contributions, SBS, the retirement, depending on if the employees are tier 1, 2, 3, or 4. All those numbers then have to be worked out by finance down to the penny on the projections. And that all has to reconcile so that they can send all the information to the printer, who can then print the tax bills. Right. And get them out the door to everybody.
And the fiscal year starts July 1st.
July 1.
So July 1st, 2015 to June 30th, 2016 is the budget cycle we're working on now.
Correct, and that's called...
Funding all our schools, all our roads, all our fire service areas. And
it is, and it's called fiscal year 2016.
Yeah. Fiscal year 2016.
And it is not easy. You will hear, in particular, you'll hear from the school district. But I think every department in the borough shares the attitude. It's not easy to sit here right now. I mean, this is the end of April 2015, and I need to budget till the end of June 2016.
Correct.
And I need to project right now and think, for my department, are we going to get sued? Is somebody going to mess something? Are we going to have a borough employee run into somebody with their vehicle?
That's what some of the unknowns and
that's what some of those
come with budgets.
For.
And of course, when I was sitting on the assembly too, one of the hardest things I think for assembly members, including the mayor and certainly the borough staff, is not really knowing the money coming from the state. Say like for our schools, the total amount. They're still, I think, in June or at this moment working on school funding. There's some amendments before them they got to vote on, and obviously there's been some cuts this year. That affects our budget, correct?
It does. And that's one of the reasons that our budget, we haven't jumped in whole hog, so to speak.
It's hard to until the legislation.
Until because it would, back to schools, when we're talking about the large component of schools, well, if the schools, we get a lot of money from the state.
Right.
Rightly so, to pay for our schools.
We're talking about total dollars, $409 million, and borough revenue is $125 million, so there's a huge chunk of money coming from basically the state and some federal.
And so not knowing how much money, just one line item is the schools, not knowing what that's going to be. Another thing we never know.
It must drive the schools crazy, I bet, just trying just sure the anticipation of not knowing. And of course, I'm not the process in Juneau's got to run its course too, so
sure.
Nothing wrong with that.
The other thing that we've always are always paying attention to this time of year in Juneau is municipal shared revenue, because when we get if we get any unrestricted municipal shared revenue, it goes into the Areawide fund. So in years past, we get $3.5 million. Back when the oil prices were really high, we got $6 million one year. That's simply area-wide revenue. And what the Assembly did was lower real property taxes.
Exactly.
They said, well,
new revenue coming in.
We would have had to expend 10.5 mils, but we got all this money from the state, so we're going to go down to 9.6.
We're probably not going to be having any of that this year, I'd assume, coming out of Juneau. So
I don't know. They're not done yet. Sometimes I think that looking at the budget, for the general person looking at the budget, it could look daunting. You look at this book, and there's all this stuff and all these tabs, but you really, if you start at the front and look at the summaries and kind of start there, you start to see how things
work,
break out. You look at the borough manager's office, administration. Oh, okay, there it is. Well, what is that money? Then you go to the tab and you find it. You see line by line, travel expenses, office supplies, contractual services, professional services, wages, benefits,
every
insurance.
little penny is detailed.
It is.
That's what impressed me on the first budget. Every penny is accounted for, in and out. Revenue coming in, expenses going out.
You're going to get you're going to get the big view. You're going to get the ordinance itself, the 7-page ordinance that says the total amount spent is $400 million, the total amount collected is $400 million, and those numbers line up with all the different sources.
Correctly.
And then it's going to set all the mill rates and all that stuff. And then if you pass through that, you're going to roll into what's called the budget summary. There'll be a few pages at the front of the budget, and you'll see revenue, Fund 100, revenue, 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 and then, so they have about 8 pages of summary of revenue. So it's more than, it's in the budget ordinance. And then you'll get expenditure detail. And you'll have all the different divisions in the borough, not just the departments, but the actual divisions, planning, platting, cultural resources. Like here, there's one for planning administration, which means the director of planning and a couple of secretaries. And then things that share from
It's very detailed.
Very detailed.
And even more detailed than the 3,
And then it goes even farther. Because if you want to look at
every dime of that department,
you can go into planning administration and look at office supplies. And see a line that says office supplies.
Exactly.
You see a line that says
and you
furniture.
can see, and I believe it's back 3 years, so you can see that line item for 3 years past.
Correct.
So you can see if there's growth or decrease.
So what you can see is, like here, this is the revenue line. But what you can see is you can see the actuals from the year fiscal year 2014 because they've been audited and we know for sure what they are. You will then see the year that we're currently in.
2015.
Because we're not done yet with our budget.
2015, correct.
And then you'll see what's being proposed for next year.
We're going to work on right now for 2016.
Yeah.
So it's very detailed. My first budget cycle. I was very impressed with, how detailed it is and how much staff puts into each of their departmental budgets. I'm sure you guys work at it a lot, and then of course we go through the process. I guess the political process sometimes when Assembly.
That's right.
Works on the budget.
Yep.
And but it is a process, and then of course it's got to be passed by May 31st and going to go in effect by July 1st for the next year. And
correct. It takes effect immediately, but the practical effect is the tax bills go out on July 1st, and then typically what happens is the ordinance will also set the due dates for taxes.
Exactly.
So you get your tax bill on July 1st, and you have an option to pay all at once or in 2 parts.
Exactly.
The first part being in
August, I think.
August.
First payment's August.
And the next payment's February.
So
when you pay the February taxes, you're actually paying on the bill that was from last June.
Exactly.
Or July.
So.
And then we start all over. And I know that for some of the larger departments, we get done with the budget, summer hits, which is busy for everybody, and right around September, October, they start calling their division heads together and start talking about what are we doing, because by January, they're submitting, and then February, March, we're talking with the manager, April, May, we're here with the assembly, and then over and over.
It's a very detailed process, and of course every assembly member, we've got 7 assembly members, will be receiving their booklet. I bet it's today and tomorrow, and start working on it and do the public hearings.
It's imminent, yeah.
It's a lot of work. What is the definition of excise taxes? I think a lot of people would like to know. What exactly does excise mean, tax?
An excise.
What does it include?
An excise could include almost anything, but typically you see excise taxes on things. It's the privilege of engaging in the business.
So that tobacco tax.
So the tobacco tax is an excise tax.
Is alcohol tax an excise tax?
There is an alcohol excise tax, I believe, at the state level. I'm not entirely sure on that. We do not have one. We can't have one by state law. We're restricted by state law. We cannot tax alcohol except sales tax.
So it'd have to be a sales tax?
Have to be a sales tax.
Would that have to go to the ballot?
Yes. So an excise tax, like our tobacco excise tax, does not require that anyone buy or sell anything. It is a privilege to possess cigarettes, and the person who pays for that privilege is the wholesaler. And so when the wholesaler transports cigarettes into the Mat-Su Borough, they must pay our tax. When the wholesaler transports cigarettes into the state of Alaska from the lower 48, they must pay the state's tax. And so you can excise things. There are other excise taxes nationwide on things like when you hear about a plastic bag tax, when you hear about communities who want to limit, landfill, plastic bag tax is often an excise of like a penny a bag or something like that.
So that's just other revenue, added on to our revenue.
That would be other revenue. In years past, there was a discussion, of course, of sales tax. That would just be area-wide revenue. Severance tax went to the ballot a few years ago. That would be area-wide revenue. Our motor vehicle tax is area-wide revenue. We used to have an airplane tax.
Yeah, I guess, if there's one thing you know, that's really significant is when you see a big number like 400, our total budget is 409 million, how much smaller the borough's input into that, 125 million of that 409 million. I guess that's one thing. And then of that 125 million, which is total revenue of the borough, only about 80 million is property tax revenue. You know, I think that's a little bit misunderstood, you know, so.
Yeah, according to our projected 2015-2016 budget, the total revenue projected right now, and you know it's not totally complete, is 131 million, and of that, real property taxes, area-wide real property taxes, is 79.7 million. So
right. So we say 80 million, but the total revenue is considerably more of the borough.
Correct. The overall total revenue is considerably more to the borough.
Do you have a number on the overall total revenue for the new budget? So that, you know, the property tax peoples, you know, should be aware that when you see the total borough revenue, their property tax is only 79 million of that. And we're trying to hold that number down so that the mill rate doesn't increase and cause more property taxes for the taxpayer. And I can honestly say the borough has been very successful. I think in the last 5 years, the mill rate, area-wide mill rate, has showed a steady decline in the mill rate.
If there's a little federal money in there, I'm not sure.
Yeah, the total budget, 400 million, is a big number. The total part of the borough's budget, 125 million, is a more accurate thing for Mat-Su residents and taxpayers to be looking at. And then of that 125 million, like I've said many times, you know, 79 million is property taxes. That'd be your area-wide tax. Then of course you got to remember, I don't want to, you know, fool anybody. You got your road service area levy on there. You got your fire service area, maybe a flood service, and that non-area wide. And when we're talking about non-area wide, sometimes people have questions on what does that cover? What does non-area wide cover? It's my understanding.
Yeah, non-area wide covers actually
libraries,
animal control, economic development.
Right. So a smaller number. That's why that number 0.052 is always a smaller number. So.
Correct.
And then the cities can have their own libraries themselves, correct? And they're funding those and paying for them. And
correct.
Right.
Correct.
Totally separate. Wouldn't be part of this budget.
Correct.
Part of the city budget.
It would be part of the city budget. The borough has been generous in
right.
helping the cities out by giving
block grants
in the past, which we're able to do by, you know, intergovernmental transfer.
Let's talk about grants a little bit. I think that's another thing. And it's part of other revenue coming to the borough. That'd be part of our total revenue, 125 million. So if we get a grant from the state of Alaska, thankfully, say for $1,200,000 to build a fire hall, that'd be what we're talking about, grant money coming from the state that's going to be administered by the borough
right.
to build a fire hall wherever the location is. But it's not going to affect your property tax, is it?
Well, it might lower your property tax. And here's how. So if we get $1 million grant, the state actually allows you to take money from the grant to pay for the people that are administering the grant. And that is the accountants who have to do it. Right. It's the legal team that might have to get involved and look at the scope.
That's your administrative cost.
The clerk in preparing legislation, you know, the assembly considering and passing legislation. So we call that generally admin and audit fees. And the borough takes less than we can. We're entitled to take more. Usually most granting agencies allow 10%. We take 5%. It's a fiscally conservative thing. It also allows the grant to be spent more on, you know, quote, what it's supposed to be for, unquote. So we take 5%.
Construction. You know.
And then it goes, that 5% goes into area-wide revenue. So if we get...
That money could be used to pay the departments.
Pays anything.
Yeah, pays anything that goes as
total
revenue.
It's area-wide revenue. It's
exactly.
Another cup that gets poured into area-wide revenue is the admin and audit fees from the grant. And so if we get a $10 million grant, that's $500,000 of revenue into...
Which could reduce the mill rate because the mill rate is set based on total revenue to total expenses.
Correct. Now typically, grants, when you think of something like the rail grant, right? We may have, you know, get $10 million from the state. We're probably going to have $500,000 worth of extra internal work because of it, because it's such a large...
The railroad project's a good example too, because there's very little, if any, borough revenue or borough property taxes spent on that project is
zero.
Is zero. That's my understanding too. So all of that is money coming from a different source.
It is.
The state of Alaska.
And when people say, hey, but you've got your You've got your capital projects director and your right-of-way guy.
Right,
And
that's
your
that
lawyers
5%.
involved.
That's that 5%.
That's that 5% that went into area-wide revenue.
Right,
and
exactly.
got poured into
And we
everybody's.
spread it out in the budget to
That's
pay
right.
for that. So
That's right. There are no
exactly.
property
So it
tax dollars.
does reduce the mill rate to a certain extent, probably negligible, small, but it does.
Yeah.
And but I think that's kind of misunderstood. People don't understand the grants coming down from the state, even if they're small ones.
For sure. I mean,
Yeah, it's
any money that comes from the state, we put a bid out
Right.
for the projects. Well, that's our purchasing office.
Exactly.
You know, all the work they do and the publication and the evaluation and the opening of the bids and all that. That's
So
one of the
let's-
sources that gets paid for.
I guess. And one thing too on schools. Now, you know, we've got it's a big ticket number, but the borough's only function is to fund schools. They put the total budget together with the state revenues, with our revenues, and then they have their own separate school board, own separate administration. They spend the money as they have a budget just like ours, correct?
Correct. So the state law is very specific that the borough assembly makes available to the school district the total sum, is what it says.
Right.
The total amount to be spent. But you cannot dictate how they spend it.
Exactly. So they have their own system, and we just get the money over there through our
And the other
means.
corollary to that is our mayor and all mayors in the state of Alaska have the line item veto except in the school board budget. So the mayor could veto the entire school board budget, but the mayor cannot line item
So the
veto.
$53 million that borough money that we send over, he could line in and veto that?
It's like handing your kids $3 and sending them to the store without you. You
Good.
can't tell them how to spend it. I don't.
Well, school funding, it's for the last 4 years, there's been a request by the school administration through Dr. Pramel and the school district, and of course the school board approves the budget that's being sent over to the assembly. There's been a 3% increase. And the justification for that, which is accurate and it's true and it's needed, is number of students are rising 400 or 500 per year in the Mat-Su Borough. We're the only district in the state of Alaska that has a big growth at this time in number of students, which not only causes their costs to go up, operating costs, but causes us to have to think about building new buildings and new schools and things like that. So it's a growth pattern.
They are growing, and they have to pay just like everyone else. They have to pay for heat and
Right.
light and
Right, so the growth is causing their operating budget to go up, plus us to bond out to build new schools.
correct.
So I think that's a positive thing, I think, for the Mat-Su Borough. I think throughout the state we have the best school system, we have the best going, the highest numbers and things like that. So we're pretty proud of that. So, and that's the share of the tax dollars going to that is good in my book. And
So a lot of people say, well, okay, your assessments are going up by 2.8%, and your
mill rate.
your assessments are going up by 2.8%, and people are building new buildings. So there's even more value out there. So that's even more tax revenue to roll in. Why is the mill rate going up? Why isn't it just going down? Because you have all this other stuff. Well, with expanded neighborhoods and expanded what makes property values go up is building and services, we do these things like new schools,
Right.
which require more teachers and more electricities. We do these things like
More
new roads.
operating money.
Correct. Well, roads. We have road service areas, great. But from the Areawide Fund, we also pay for the managers to manage those contracts. If we create more roads, we need more people to maintain those roads. We do some of the summer maintenance ourselves, the right-of-way inspectors for all of the right-of-way permits for when subdividers go in and you have to locate utilities or driveway permits. All of those inspectors come online in the summertime for the borough, and they go out and they inspect and make sure everything's done in a safe and legal manner. As you have more development, you need more people to provide those services. Thanks, Vern. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Nick. It has been a pleasure. It's every time I deal with the budget, I learn something new, and I certainly learned something today from you. So I appreciate that, and I think I'll go into this year's budget cycle having a little bit of an advantage over some of the other assembly members, just having an hour or two with you.
Well, there you go.
So.